for the last show of the last chapter, basically. That would be chapter 26 of The Sword and the Rose. For those of you who are just joining me, wow, you pretty much missed almost everything. So go back to my past broadcasts and you can watch me go through everything up until tonight. Also, I have another book that I read before that, and that's also up in my past broadcast, so you can watch that, then watch this one, and you'll have yourself a little bit of things to watch. But tonight I'm going to be rounding out with chapter 26. So without further ado, here I go. Chapter 26. They had gathered together, including Lysanne's party. They found that they had lost 7 men. Not seriously bad, commented Melgaltha. Seeing we do what we have to do. Yes, answered Gwalsor. Now all we have to do is get back to Gwilla's Hole safely. They hardly needed Pemberlent's assurance that they were being pursued, and pursued vigorously. Would you want to be one of those to admit that you'd had your baron kidnapped from the midst of your camp? No, we'd expected this. Let's travel on for a while and see what happens. We're a little over a day's travel to Gwilla's Hole, but we can't follow the direct route, not with Warwick's main body between us and our goal. On the other hand, we won't travel so indirectly as we did on the way out. We have our prisoner, and we are more than strong enough to fight off any foraging party we're likely to encounter. He looked around at his men. Shall we ride then? There were nods of agreement. Tostig flicked up his axe in salute. The axe that had done such damage in the dash through Warwick's camp. Gwalsor urged his horse into motion. The next day, still about a morning's ride out of Gwilla's Hole, Pemberlent informed them that the pursuit was continuing. About 20 horse, my Lord Baron, Pemberlent said. They must feel desperate. They know quite well how many they're chasing. The foot are far behind, though they too are continuing to come. Oh yes, they'll be desperate by now, Malga. I think it's time we dealt with this lot. Are you seriously sure you want to do this, Lord? Every man we kill here is another less for Warwick's army if it comes to a fight later. So we fight? How far are they back? Approximately a quarter of an hour, Lord, Pemberlent said. So we stop, rest horses a little, and wait for them to catch up? Gwalsor nodded. I think Warwick has too many advantages for us to ignore any small edge we might take. Not too much later, the band of small horsemen wearing Warwick colors came into view. They hesitated a moment at the sight of much superior force, then hurled themselves forward in a frantic charge. It was no real battle, more of a slaughter. 5 of Warwick's horsemen finally fled. Let them go, called Gwalsor. We've more important things to do than to pursue a few fugitives. He didn't bother to ask Pemberlent how far behind the infantry were. They'd already drawn the foot so far out that way, even if they did come to Gwilla's Hole today, they'd be so worn by forced marching that they'd be of little use in a battle. Forsyth looked worriedly across the field. Chevaux de Frise covered all the approaches to his position, which were not otherwise made impassable by thick brush, woods, or a steep bank down to the course of the Flingkettle Brook. There were small parties of archers guarding the bank and hiding in the woods to make outflanking him on either side costly and giving him time to shift the troops if necessary. He'd kept most of the horse that remained to him well back in hopes of preventing Warwick's commander from seeing how scant he was in that arm. Tell me, he asked his commanders, does there not seem to be more movement in the enemy camp today? Randindar Saltor, old, grizzled, and veteran of a number of fights, nodded his head. I'd say we're in for it this morning, Marshal. I think our young baron had twisted Warwick's tail for him. Forsyth nodded, stroking a hand down his beard. Could be he has. Ah, here they come. You sound almost relieved to be attacked, Marshal. Saves me from fussing myself to death over whether I ought to be making myself ready for them when they come. The first attack was by footmen, coming up on Foraith's right, clearly meaning to open a route through the obstacles for their horse to come through. Foraith nodded. It was what he expected, and there was no need to send others to that quarter. The commanders on the spot knew quite well what they had to do. Even as he watched, arrows began to shower the attacking force, and bodies dotted the track of their advance. But enemy archers were replying, and though his men were hidden in the barricades of earth and logs, they began to take casualties as well. The Grendel men had some protection, unlike the attackers in the open, and though the tide of the attack rolled up to the edge of the obstacles, it was driven back by the intensity of the arrow storm. They shouldn't be too willing to do that again, he muttered, looking at the bodies dotting the field. I wonder what they'll do instead. Given the usual standard of competitiveness among soldiers, a commander could often convince a body of troops that they could succeed where another body had failed. And so it proved shortly after. The next attack surged up the slope. Warwick men reached the front row of the obstructions, withered under the arrows of the defenders, and retired. Some of the first rank of the chevaux de frise had been partially broken down. They don't have enough men to make much of a success of such attacks at this rate, my Lord Marshal, Randon said. No, but they might if they think of waiting until night when the light is more tricky for archery. A lot depends on how much of a hurry they're in. The answer to that appeared shortly. A ballista, mounted on a cart, was wheeled up through the enemy ranks. Ha! Said Randon. Now we're in for it. Ballista's not rightly a field weapon, but they've got one, my lord. What I'd ask is, when did they make it? It's the sort of thing you'd build at a castle under siege, using whatever lumber and ropes you find handy. You don't make it here and haul it all the way to Grendel Castle. They might have been thinking of reducing the fort here at Gwillim's Hole, but I doubt that. But if they just realized even last night that they might need it, then it's probably thrown together, and they might not get the use out of it they could. The first stone from the catapult was smashed a log in the first row of chevaux de frise. Foraith could hear the archers jeering from behind their barricade. The next stone went far over the defending archers' heads. Their jibes redoubled. They haven't had time to range the thing properly, Foraith said. That's one on our side, and a bowman shooting arrows, all made the same, can be fairly sure of putting them in the same target at a decent range. When they use stones in the ballista, no matter how carefully they pick the things, they won't all fly exactly the same. This is going to take them a while. The next stone whipped over the archer's head, quieting them a little, and the one after that thumped into the barricade itself. They'll have to send them across the top of the barricade, Foraith said, or better still, break down the top edge of it, hoping to injure our men with flying debris. It's likely to be a long process. He summoned a messenger. Go to the commander of the archers there. Tell him to have his command. He pointed. Tell him to have his men hunker down as long as the catapult is shooting. Have them pop up again when the attack starts. Yes, my Lord Marshal. Randall spoke up. Our young baron must have done his job, if they can't wait for tonight. Foraith nodded, smiling grimly. Must have done. They want to fight a battle, beat us, and drive us back into Grendel. When they come to ransom back their lord, they'll make sure they've scraped clean whatever land of ours they hold, down to the last scrawny cow and withered grain of barley before they withdraw. And hope to pay the ransom out of plunder from our own land, Brandon said. Foraith stroked his chin. Of course, they also know we're missing upward of 100 horse. If they can push their way through our barricades and obstacles, they know we haven't the cavalry to withstand them. And even if the baron does arrive back in time, we might be hard put to win a battle, and here they come again. For the most part, the stones from the ballista smashed into the upper part of the central portion of the work sheltering the archers. To change the ballista's aim horizontally would risk putting it off its aim vertically. However, it gave limited cover, given that the ballista could shoot well over the heads of the attacking troops until they got very near to their goal. and the attackers were able to get closer before the defending archers started their own work. "Ha!" said Forsyth. "They've swung the ballista to shoot at the flanks of the barricade. Better to risk the occasional shot among our own troops and kept our men wary." But more infantry were coming now, archers and others as well. The first attackers were into the zigzag paths left in the pattern of the chevaux de frise to allow sallies of the Grendel horse, frantically smashing and tearing at the edges to make a straight path for their own. Archers were also moving up the obstacles, shortening their range, making their fire more effective. Forsyth called another messenger. "First reserves to stand in the support of the defense. They'll break through." Forsyth nodded. If they don't break first. Ha! Look there." The ballista stopped shooting. One of its arms twisted at an angle. "I thought perhaps it might be breaking down sooner than it ought. Too bad it held up for so long as it did, though. It might just have served its purpose." "Yes, my lord. Should we have our horse move to support this threatened part of the fortification?" "Not just yet. Should it end that our lads do stand them off, we may have to move them again." Gwalsor's detachment crossed the old bed of Flingcuttle Brook, a little down to the south of Gwilla's Hole, and cantered northward in a direction that would bring them in behind their army's positions. Suddenly Malgatha leaned towards Gwalsor. "Fighting ahead, lord." Then Gwalsor heard it too, the far-off ringing of metal on metal. He turned to the men assigned to guard the Baron. "Come up behind us carefully. If the battle is lost, make for the castle. Keep him safe, whatever you do. If you must, put a dagger in him rather than let him be rescued." "Yes, my lord Baron." "The rest of you, come with me. Hold your horses in a bit. We'll be of no use to anyone if we arrive on mounts too fatigued to charge." Gwalsor talked lightly to Forsyth about withdrawing and peppering the army with arrows, but he knew very well how difficult a fighting withdrawal could be. The least thing might turn into a panicked rout. "They must have gotten word about the Baron," he said. "Seems so. They want to pay his ransom from our lands." Despite his warning about tiring the horses, Gwalsor was almost ready to urge his horse into a gallop. But he knew his first intention had been correct. Wearing out the horses could be fatal if they were needed at would be fatal if they were needed at the battlefield. Over another rise they came, and around the curve of wood, and there was the fight. The enemy had clearly come up along the south side of the road, across the old course of the Flingcuttle Brook, and up the slope. The infantry had managed to push their way up the barricade, clearing a path through the chevaux de frise for their horse. The infantry had also succeeded in taking a section of the barricade, allowing the Warwick horse to be brought up into the gap, and there was now a mixed melee of infantry and horse of both sides struggling there. One side sought to push to the east, the other side sought to hold them, and though the men of Grendel were fighting with all their might, they were outnumbered. The fight was moving slowly. At any time it might well become a rout. Without slowing, he called, "Lisanne!" "My lord?" "Take 20 men. Attack there." He pointed where Grendel forces were stretched to the limit. "Just at that flank. Make sure you're using our cry out loud and clear as you come, so as not to panic our own men. The rest of you, follow me." He barely heard Lisanne's acknowledgement as he spurred his horse into motion. "The banner!" They galloped to place themselves behind the thin stretched line of Grendel's men. Then Gwalsor signaled his force to fall into the line. At the sound of the horn, they charged in. "The rose!" he shouted. "The sword and the rose!" he heard the cry taken up by the others. Then they were into melee themselves. Gwalsor was aware that they would not have much time in which to turn the battle around. They'd been riding all morning, and when both horses and men had about one good charge in them, after that they would begin to flag, and if Warwick's men were able to keep pressing, the battle might turn into a defeat for Grendel. But on the other hand, the Warwick men had started to battle as a movement of desperation, and seeing what seemed to be fresh troops coming up against them might be too much for them. But Gwalsor was not given much time to dwell on the possibilities and perils of battle, for he had to defend himself. The hammering din settled around him. The dust rose into his nostrils, and he caught that faint whiff of roses as well, among other stenches. The fight settled down into a confusion of blows struck and blows received. This was no practice field stuff of fighting one opponent at a time until one or the other was down. Quite frequently, he was not aware of what had happened to his opponent, only that he was no longer there. Suddenly he discovered that his shield had a wedge-shaped chip out of the edge, about a palm span in width, and for the life of him he couldn't remember the blow or the blows that had caused it. The ground underneath him was a litter of dropped weapons and fallen bodies. He hoped that was a sign that the Wardic men were being pushed back, but he could not be sure. He had a brief moment to orient himself, spying dimly through the dust a tree that had been at the flank next to the barricade. Ha! Perhaps they were prevailing! He kicked his horse into movement again. Then suddenly he was up against the barricade, as the men of Wardic fought to retreat through the opening they had made for their advance. Victory for sure! He laid about him even harder, shouting as hard as he could, as though his very voice could force them to flee faster. Through the dust he saw a small rat-faced man wielding a crossbow. Panic seized him. In the press there was nowhere to flee, no way to dodge. The crossbowman raised his weapon and shot, then disappeared under a sudden surge of men in Grendel colors. Gwalsor felt a rap on his shield and a blow on his upper arm. He looked down, with no surprise, to see a crossbow bolt sticking out of his bicep. The shield had slowed it considerably, otherwise it would have most likely gone straight through. Suddenly his panic dissolved under anger. If he had lost one arm, he would see to it that the battle was done and won before he fell. He pressed on, through the gap in the barricade, hewing this way and that, down the slope into the old course of the Flynn Kettle Brook. Valis jumped the gap, but the ground was not firm, and his hind legs slid backward. He fell. Gwalsor was dashed to the ground. The crossbow bolt in his arm twisted, and he screamed with pain and fainted. He thought his unconsciousness had lasted a moment, but when he opened his eyes, he was in a tent. "You're awake, then?" He rolled his head over and saw the Lafetta beside him. "I am. We've won?" "We win for seriously certain, but you nearly destroyed our victory party." He remembered. "My arm, Melga! There was a crossbow bolt." "It made a hole in your arm. You made the hole worse when you fell, but the healers did their work, and Pemberlin came in and did a special spell against infection. No, Lord, you have not lost your arm. Lie back while I tell Forith that you're awake." The Lafetta slipped out. Malga was not one for giving false assurances, but to be certain, Gwalsor had reached his right hand over to feel his arm. He immediately wished he hadn't, for he touched the wounded bicep first, and a wave of pain drove him unconscious again. He was sitting outside his tent, and thanks to the concoction given to him by Pemberlin, his arm was only twinging a bit, though he knew it should hurt abominably. "I've no claim to be a healer, my Lord Baron, but I know a few things about herbs." Gwalsor had insisted on sitting out where the men could see him. "If I stay on a pallet in a tent, they'll know I'm dying. We don't need that sort of rumor going around." He had a cup of wine beside him, poor sour stuff that in ordinary circumstances he would have refused to drink, but he knew that, as bad as it was probably better than what the men were getting. Pemberlin had warned him. "Drink a bit if you wish, but with that concoction inside of you, too much wine will most certainly render you unconscious, and if you drink it too fast, it could conceivably kill you." Forith came tramping up, smiling broadly. "You hear them singing down the road at by the campfires, Lord? You know what they're singing?" Gwalsor shook his head. "I can hear the singing, but I can't make out any words from here. I think that stuff about Pemberlin gave me has deadened my senses a bit." "Oh, it's quite a song. Songs, I should say, since there seems to be another version for every campfire. One of the ones I like best goes, 'Old hook hand into battle rolled, with full diddle day. Old hook hand into battle rode, and Wardic reaped what he had sowed, right for diddle day.' There's a dozen or so more verses too, lad. Another of my favorite goes, 'Old hook hand cut down Warwick's tent, with a full diddle all day. Old hook hand cut down Warwick's tent, wrapped him up, and away he went, fo diddle day.'" Gwalsor smiled. "I'm old hook hand then?" And most of them have near twice my years. Why, they like you, lad. When you first came, the talk was how harsh you'd be on a rebel barony. But you fought for them, and you fought alongside them, and you've taken your own risks to make it so they won't have to fight again for a while. It was not lost on Gwalsor that Forraith was calling him lad, now as well as lord, and it occurred to him that he appreciated the change. The talks progress? Oh, in fits and starts. We've a knight or two of ours, while they can't hardly suggest that an ordinary knight rates the payment of a baron. They're trying to raise the rates as high as they can. But then, we've got a knight or two of theirs, so anytime they raise the ransom for ours, we raise a ransom for theirs. But we'll come to an agreement in a day or two, lad. Gwalsor nodded in agreement, then closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the moon was up. Someone had put a cloak over him. Have you had enough of sitting out here being admired yet? He turned his head. Yes, Melga. No one thought to wake me? The white grin showed again. Thought to? They did all but prick your rump with a dagger. Some said that Pemberlin had poisoned you, but he and the healer agreed that you were so tired and the wine was too much, and sleep most likely better for you. Now, here, my arm. Try not to stand too fast. Yes? Do you like that? You're faint. Now, are you ready to walk? Slowly, slowly. You don't want to run any races until tomorrow. Oh, look at that. So, wait, one more thing. Apparently, there was like the one-page chapter 27, also known as the epilogue. Chapter 27. Baron's coming in, called the watchman. Army's with them. As the gates swung open, the army came in. At the head were the leaders, old Forraith, looking like what he was, a common man raised to knighthood. Now the head of the Baron's armies, dark-clad Melgathop on his reindeer, the Baron's Lafetta aide, Tosteg the reformed bandit, an axe at his belt, and the Baron himself, pale and drawn, his left arm in a sling. A man of middle years, an ex-soldier from the Scars, was the first to speak, calling out, "Welcome home, old Hookhand!" The cry was taken up with variations of, "Hey, old Hookhand! Old Hookhand's our boy!" And somewhere someone started to sing, "Old Hookhand into battle rolled with a full little all day." Melgathop leaned forward and said something into the Baron's ear, and the Baron smiled faintly. Then his eye fell on Brennan, standing in the crowd, Jadal by her side, and his smile broadened. So, that's the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. I actually enjoyed reading it, and I think I'm getting more of the hang of this reading stuff. So, like I said, I'm going to be taking some little time off. I'll be back, so not next Monday, but the Monday after that, and I will have a new story to read. And it'll be, I think I know which one the next one is going to be, but I'll let you know when it comes back. So have a good night, and I will talk to you again in about a week and a half.